Ho, 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 heathens! How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and typically I'm critically analyzing apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Around this time of year, one big question is normally brought up, and that's the virgin birth, and a lot of elements surrounding the virgin birth or the nativity that's in the Bible. Recently, there was a debate between Jimmy Akin and John Loftus, as well as Caleb Jackson and Darren Slade, where they discussed the virgin birth. And there was a number of things that were said in that debate that I highly disagree with. I've decided to bring on a special guest for this special edition of Godless Engineer this Christmas season, and that's Dr. Aaron Adair. In this particular video, Dr. Adair and I are going to be going through Jimmy Akin's syllogism for proving the virgin birth as a fact of history. Trust me, it's going to be underwhelming. So if you want to fuck around and find out how wrong Jimmy Akin is about the virgin birth, then please stay tuned. Ho, 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 heathens! How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I have Dr. Aaron Adair here with me today, and we are going to be discussing some topics from the Jimmy Akin versus John Loftus, as well as Caleb versus Darren Slade debate. And there's a couple of sections here that we really kind of wanted to get into. So we're going to be talking about Jimmy Akin's arguments from for the virgin birth, and then we're also going to be talking about the Bethlehem star. And so we're going to be discussing those two things today. Dr. Aaron Adair, why don't you tell people like who you are, where they can find you, and all that kind of great stuff?
Yeah. So first off, main way to find me is my website, drandadair.com. That'll link to all my other socials and anything that I've published that I want to beat my chest about. Background, so PhD in physics from The Ohio State University, currently a research affiliate at MIT in physics education research, while my day job is as a data scientist in the defense sector. Written a number of books related to the intersection of science and religion. Most recently, Aliens and Religion, Where Two Worlds Collide. I co-wrote that with my friend Jonathan M.S. Pierce. And probably the book that's of more important for today is the Christmas book I have, The Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical View. That was my first major book, but I've also had a couple of articles related to the same subject before and after, in some ways also kind of related to this subject. So full disclosure, I've actually had about a decade ago some like back and forth comment section conversation with Jimmy Akin about the subject of the star. And the debate with John Loftus that we're going to be looking at, Loftus also published a book chapter about the Star of Bethlehem in one of his anthologies. So I'm kind of connected to a couple of these folks here. So full disclosure, if that was necessary.
No, that's awesome. That's great to know because I had no idea that you had already kind of conversed with Jimmy Akin on this. I tried to get Jimmy Akin to do a debate with Richard Carrier, and he just flatly denied any kind of debate on at least on the topic of mythicism. But in any case, so today we have the argument for the virgin birth, and we wanted to start here with this review. And I have to say I was woefully unimpressed by it, but maybe somebody in the comment section can explain it further. But I also am very excited to hear what your take is on the argument as we progress through it. So are you ready to get to the actual argument?
Yeah, let's hop into it. Do we want to give some background for the audience about what we're going to be looking at?
Yeah, sure. Do you want to give the background?
So just the basic thing that this was supposed to be a 2-on-2 debate that was being hosted on Cameron Bertuzzi's channel, Capturing Christianity. You had Jimmy Akin, a relatively well-known Catholic apologist, along with Caleb. Oh gosh, why am I forgetting his last name right now?
I had a conversation with him a while ago, and I cannot remember Jackson. I think it's Caleb Jackson.
Thank you. Yeah, Caleb Jackson. So arguing for basically a traditional view on the reality of the miracles of the New Testament, while on the other side you had John Loftus and Darren Slade arguing for this being humbug.
Humbug. I like how you put that. Very festive.
The Santa hat is getting to me.
All right. So, like I said, we're going to be starting with Jimmy Akin's argument for the virgin birth.
So this is an argument that I find convincing for the virgin birth. It is a theological argument. It has 8 premises and 7 conclusions. And it goes like this. If God exists, then he's infinitely perfect. And God exists, so God is infinitely perfect. That's just a simple modus ponens inference from the first 2 premises.
Yeah. All right. So I think it's a bit interesting that, first off, to make his argument for the historicity of something, he's not relying on an historical argument, but he's trying to do some sort of logical proof deduction. And not only is it the case that when you have a logical argument that you have to have the correct form, that has to be in a logical format that's valid, but all of the premises have to be true. And in particular, with an argument of this form, the most likely the final conclusion can be true is going to depend on the weakest premise. So this is also a little bit weird. Earlier on, before he got to this argument here, he's saying, like, we have to make sure we have common ground so that way these sorts of arguments. And what does he do to present to a couple of atheists? God exists as a premise. All right, that is clearly not a convincing argument to us heathens. Honestly, this argument is only going to be convincing to Catholics, and in which case it's not really rhetorically powerful. In the art of rhetoric and argument, the whole point of these sorts of things is you set up premises that you either assume your audience already accepts, or you're able to argue for the truth of those premises. If you just throw a bunch of premises out there and your audience or your interlocutors deny most of them, if not all of them, it's not a successful argument. Then in which case you have to argue for each premise, in which case each premise is itself an argument, which what we would call not a good rhetorical strategy. So just from the start, the fact that he's doing this is actually somewhat both concerning. It kind of goes against what he says earlier about saying, hey, we want to make sure we're on the same plane, that we're arguing from the same basic premises, to hop into premises that no one accepts except for people who already agree with him.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that starting, because this entire syllogism here makes it seem like, that they're presuming that God exists. And I think that really kind of convolutes the conversation about the virgin birth in general, because now you're talking about like, oh, well, we dispute your idea that God exists. And it's specifically in, I wish that he would have been a bit more specific because he's not just arguing God exists, but he's arguing the Christian God exists as denoted by their Holy Bible. And so it seems like they're building, Jimmy is building this entire argument off of this flimsy foundation and presumption that God already exists. And so I feel like most of this argument is just like somehow proving that the logic of the internal logic of Christianity, as far as getting to the virgin birth goes, is logically consistent and valid as far as the way that he's put it. And it doesn't really do anything other than that. It's like, okay, yeah, sure. Your book says God did this. And I feel like that's the entire story that Jimmy is telling with this syllogism. It's just, my book says a thing, therefore I believe the thing.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to probably break this down a little bit more, but really, this is just a long-winded, sophisticated way of saying exactly what Ken Ham does. God said it, I believe it, that settles it. It's really not going to be ultimately more sophisticated than that, other than it's put in this syllogistic form. But also from the point of view of just that first premise as well, if God exists, he is infinitely perfect. I don't really know what that means, and it seems like a great way to smuggle basically the entire Catholic catechism and just stuff it right into there and all that metaphysics that would go along with that. So, like, I mean, first off, perfect, is that some sort of binary thing? Or if it's apparently infinite, it's on some sort of scale. It's like you could be more or less perfect. That's already rhetorically, linguistically a little bit interesting, because, like, am I perfect or am I not perfect? I often will see that as a binary. Of course, our Constitution talks about a more perfect union, so that's already confusing. We can have that two different ways. This at least needs explanation. You can't just throw it there as a premise and expect people to even know what the halibut that means. And of course, how is one thing more perfect than another thing? How do you get any of that? And honestly, my conception of what a perfect being is may not have anything to do with Christianity or Catholicism directly. So I just look at that premise and I'm just like, this itself could be like a dissertation for a theologian. And he just throws it in there as like saying, well, this is part of my argument. Were you going to argue against it? It's like, you got a week?
Yeah, they love to throw that infinite qualifier in there for a lot of different things that I don't know how you could actually describe them as being infinite. Like, for instance, with the Christian God, you'll hear a lot of apologists say that God is infinitely good. Like, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to be infinitely good? I have no idea what like an infinite good God is or an infinite merciful God is. Like, I have no idea how the infinite adds anything to it. To the characteristic of being good or merciful or perfect in this particular instance.
Yeah, and ultimately, I don't want to dwell on this too much. It's just that ultimately, whatever we might say there, it's kind of ultimately irrelevant to what we're trying to talk about, which is in this case, the historicity of the virgin birth. God could exist, and the virgin birth is nonsense. God could exist and inspired the Bible, and the Bible isn't telling us historical truths. There is just it's other premises in here that are even worth talking about, and the rest is ultimately window dressing to smuggle in the entirety of Catholic metaphysics.
Yeah. You ready to continue?
Let's go.
If God is infinitely perfect, then he's accurate in what he says. And since we already concluded he's infinitely perfect, that means God is accurate in what he asserts. Premise 4, if the New Testament is inspired by God, then God asserts what the New Testament asserts. The New Testament is inspired by God.
So when this thing is talking about what the New Testament asserts, this is also kind of a assumption-laden premise. So we're specifically talking about the New Testament. Okay. If we were talking about the Old Testament as well, and I think he probably would also say that the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is also inspired, there are things in there like poems. I mean, especially if you go to like the Song of Songs. What's being asserted there? God's got a big dong? It's kind of hard to know what might be going on there and those sorts of assertions. The fact of the matter is, this is also assuming a lot about the genre of the materials of the New Testament and ultimately then what they are trying to claim there. And, oh boy, we're also going to assume that basically the New Testament has speaking with one voice, that it's univocal. Basically, what Mark says and what Matthew says and what Luke says is all from the same source, so they're all perfectly consistent with each other. And honestly, you don't even have to get past the two birth narratives to find out that ain't true, Chief. And of course, there's even more that we can be getting to about the various flagrant contradictions between the various accounts of the life of Jesus or the nature of theology or the utility of the law in the Torah, et cetera, et cetera. It's like even asserting that the New Testament asserts anything is itself really assumption-laden.
Yeah, and also I totally disagree with premise 4. Like, if the New Testament is inspired by God, then God asserts what the New Testament asserts. I feel like he's making a jump there because, I feel like that there is room for the New Testament to be quote unquote inspired by God, but that God doesn't necessarily assert like everything that's in the New Testament. Like, being inspired by something doesn't necessarily mean it's a verbatim like message from.
Yeah. So he's also taking a rather particular view of what inspired means, because many people will say inspired as in I was moved in a particular way, but I wasn't necessarily controlled. It's not like an angel came down and like grabbed my hand and forced me to move the stylus in a particular way when writing on papyrus. He seems to be really taking the assertion that basically the statements in the New Testament are like almost like direct dictation from the Almighty. It sounds more like the Quran than the Gospels. So honestly, this is also a very particular and peculiar version of what inspiration means. So again, this is also an issue, like earlier we were talking about definition issues about perfect. There's also a huge amount of theological literature, I think probably especially amongst Protestants, of what inspired means. And can the New Testament, for example, can the Bible be inspired even if it asserts things that are scientifically or historically false? I mean, after all, this is the book that talks about the dome world that we all live under on this flat earth that's held up by pillars. Is that all true assertments, or is that poetic? And of course, now we just found out, oh, maybe inspired is a whole lot fuzzier than what Jimmy is letting on in this syllogism.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the whole dome part, because even in first century like Judaism and Christianity, they believed in like the firmament, and the firmament was a physical place where beings existed, corporeal beings existed, and then there was this like tiered leveled heaven and this really weird cosmology that is not reminiscent of anything that we actually understand about our reality now. So it is kind of weird for an apologist to try to take this tactic and totally disregard what we know about this culture that produced the Gospels.
Mm-hmm. True that.
Yeah. All right. Let's see him walk through the rest of it.
All right.
Therefore, God asserts what the New Testament asserts. Again, these are all just modus ponens. Well, premise 6, it turns out the New Testament asserts the virgin birth. Therefore, God asserts what the New Testament asserts, and the New Testament asserts the virgin birth of Christ.
So right here is basically the proverbial, well, God says it happened.
Yeah. And that's ultimately what the whole argument is. All of this stuff is basically to say, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. There is really nothing more sophisticated here. So this is foregoing the entirety of historical argumentation. So, well, later on, they're going to be, of course, talking about in this debate, well, which premises do you deny? And of course, I want to, hold my tongue and not just shout all of them. But it's really the case, though, that he makes himself vulnerable when he says the New Testament is inspired by God, and therefore the case that everything that the New Testament asserts has to be true. Well, we can also run the logic backwards. I believe that would be modus tollens. If P, therefore Q, not Q, therefore not P. So we could say if everything, if the New Testament is God inspired, everything it asserts is true. Not everything the New Testament asserts is true. In fact, it's false. Therefore, it's not God inspired. So really, all we can do is just go, let's take premise 5 and its conclusion, run it backwards, and completely, stop it before we can even begin talking about virgin births, which is kind of sort of what John Loftus will be doing here when he talks about all the historical issues with the story. And I don't know which parts of the clips from that you have in here, but in a very important way, Loftus is going to be challenging the inspiration of the New Testament. If by inspired we meaning God made sure everything it said was historically accurate. It's saying things that are not historically accurate, therefore it's not inspired, therefore that hits the virgin birth claims, out of the park.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I really liked Loftus's opening I guess, opening argument against the virgin birth. He lays out a whole lot of different lines, like you were listing right there, a whole lot of different lines in which the New Testament fails as far as history goes and being accurate to reality. And so I think that he put up a pretty good argument against it. But I actually typically whenever I talk about like not believing in the Christian God or thinking that the Christian God definitely doesn't exist, I do something similar to what you described there and running the logic backwards in being that, like, if the New Testament is supposed to describe the Christian God and the New Testament doesn't describe reality in an accurate way, then that God doesn't exist. And since we can show that the New Testament doesn't describe reality accurately, that means that the God characterized by the New Testament is not real or accurate as far as a literal understanding of the God of the New Testament, which I don't know if that's really fallacious or not, but it seems to me like if you're going to put out this giant requirements document for what your God is and does and wants and everything, and it doesn't match up with reality, I kind of feel like you would effectively have to change that God in order to make it better match reality. And if you have to change it, that means that God just simply doesn't exist the way that it's originally envisioned.
Yeah, and I think this running like the logic backwards, I mean, not only is it a logical or a logically valid form of argumentation, I think in modern philosophy there's even a term for it, the Morean shift. Basically, instead of accepting the premises and following the conclusion, showing, that, hey, the conclusion is faulty, therefore running it back against the premises. And this goes to, I think, was it George Moore was the name of the philosopher? I'm definitely not going to have that exactly right. So whoever's in the comments, please correct me. But this sort of, running the logic kind of backwards and undermining the argument in that sort of way is standard fare in philosophy. It's one of the problems that happens when you choose premises that your interlocutor not only probably doesn't accept, but has good reasons to reject. So using it as the starting point of your argument is only going to make it so you're going to step forward and you're just going to be hit by a rake.
Yeah, I agree. Now, I don't have much of Loftus's opening argument as far as clipped out or whatnot. We've only really got the Bethlehem Star part of it in the next section. But I do hope that people go and watch Loftus's opening argument because it is rather good.
If God asserts what the New Testament asserts, and if the New Testament asserts the virgin birth, then it logically follows God asserts the virgin birth. So I conclude God asserts the virgin birth. And therefore, since God is accurate in what he asserts, and God is accurate in what he asserts, and he also asserts the virgin birth.
Oh, we should probably pause right there. So here's the thing, though. Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, gives us this assertion. And again, I have some issues with saying the New Testament asserts anything. But what does the Gospel of Matthew do? It says it cites from the Old Testament. It specifically cites from Isaiah 7:14. And the problem has been pointed out for centuries that there is a significant translation issue. If you go to the original Hebrew, it is not even specifying that the woman in question is actually a sexually pure virgin. Of course, the whole idea of purity is still, that's got its own, historical baggage. But nonetheless, this is not even necessarily a woman who has not had sex. In fact, if you go back to the original context of that prophecy from Isaiah, he is talking to King Hezekiah and probably pointing to a woman who was pregnant at that moment, perhaps even in the room, and saying, the kid she's got right now, by the time that kid's old enough to know the difference between good and evil, your problems will have gone away. So the historical situation is Hezekiah is basically in trouble with the Assyrian king Sennacherib. Sennacherib has already basically completely destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel and is now basically coming down south and is basically saying, hey, Hezekiah, where's my money? It's pretty much, a imperial shakedown in many ways. But Isaiah is basically saying it's going to be okay. The situation is going to resolve itself. And the important thing is what happens in the Hebrew gets changed once you go to the Greek translation of the Septuagint, which changes the original Hebrew word of Alma to the Greek word Parthenos, but also does one other thing where it changes the tense, where in Hebrew it has more of an ambiguous tense, but specifically once it's put into Greek, it's then put into the future tense. So instead of it being about something that is currently happening or has happened, it's now being set to something into the future. So this is something peculiar to the Greek translation. And that word Parthenos at the time, it didn't necessarily mean virgin. It had some more wide valence. It could just mean young woman. But by the time of Matthew, that it basically kind of lost that valence and was now much more strict in meaning basically a woman who has never had sex. So in a sense, Matthew is reading a Greek translation of the Hebrew that has already used some words that have changed its meaning in the 300-ish years between the composition of the Septuagint and Matthew's time, where the shift in the word changed. And in such a way, he's also then picking up valences that really would not have been there by the original translator. It's kind of the same way if I go back and I listen to the opening song to the Flintstones and it ends that say they're going to have a gay old time. That has nothing to do with sexuality, hetero or homosexuality, but our modern parlance has changed the meaning of gay. The same sort of kind of thing has happened with this term Parthenos. Matthew's taking the later valences of it rather than its fuller meaning that it might have had at its time of translation centuries earlier, which itself is changing a Hebrew word, which itself doesn't specify virginity, and also changing the tense, changing the historical context. And again, if we are supposed to believe that, this is a Bible from the same God, then I guess God asserts one thing in one place and one place in another. We would already say, hey, this premise kicks itself in the teeth.
I feel like what Jimmy might push back with that and say is that God knew that all of that would happen. And so because he knew all of that would happen, he's still asserting that the virgin birth happened, even if it's based off of a faulty understanding of Old Testament scripture out of the Septuagint, which I feel is just a cop out. That's basically just making up excuses for why you're still correct in your syllogism here, in your statement about it. But I feel like a lot of people don't understand what the Pesherim logic actually was, because I mean, I know that before I started looking into more of the historical claims of the New Testament and more of how Jews and Jewish Christians were writing these things, I didn't really understand what Pesherim logic was, but it kind of seems interesting that a seasoned apologist wouldn't pick up on this Pesherim tradition, or at least mention it in some kind of way. Maybe he would if somebody questioned him on this mistranslation issue, but I don't know. I feel like a lot of times whenever they come up with excuses for why they're still correct, it just seems like they're just making excuses for it, and they're twisting things so that it still makes them right. And I feel like that's just a bit disingenuous.
Well, I would say probably the response to that would be that if he accepts that there is Pesher logic, if there are the use of Pesherim in the New Testament, then he will just assert, well, God made sure that the New Testament writers used the valid forms of Pesherim. So those guys at the Dead Sea, those Essenes, they screwed up. They didn't really understand how to do Pesherim correctly. But by my divine inspiration, by use of the Holy Spirit, I made sure people Peshered right. And no, Peshered can't be used as a verb. But this is English. We can do whatever we want to other languages. We've been doing it for centuries.
English is like fuck language.
Your language doesn't have gerunds? Does now. Bam.
All right. He's got this last little bit here of this actual argument, and then he's going to go into there's a little bit of discourse on it.
All right.
Finally, for the sake of logical form, if God is accurate in what he asserts, and God asserts the virgin birth, then the virgin birth is going to be true. And since God is accurate and asserts the virgin birth, that means the virgin birth is true. Next slide, please. So the argument, in order to put it in proper logical form, so you could see the logical structure, I had to phrase it in kind of a somewhat complicated way, just to make sure all the logical steps were spelled out. But the argument uses only two logical operations: conjunction, where you connect two things that have already been established, and modus ponens. Both of those are recognized as valid logical operations. So the argument is logically valid. And the conclusion of a logically valid argument is true if the premises are true. Therefore, to defeat the argument that I've made, John must show that one or more of the premises in the argument is false.
All right, so let's pause there. All right, so what he asserts up to this point about the nature of his logical argument and logical argumentation is correct, is accurate. I don't think it's really much of a point to say I only used two different logical operations. It's still a lot of premises. You might have used relatively simple operators to get to that point. But still, if you do a lot of addition, it can still be a whole lot of time doing the math, even if it's just addition. If it's the case that you got a lot of premises, it's still a lot of, points of contention, argumentation of issues. Now, the thing, though, that is not correct here is John has to show one of the premises is false. This is not how logic works. To show that the conclusion is true, the arguer has to show, or everyone has to agree, that all the premises are true. If you can't actually show at least the premises are even probable, let alone absolutely true, then there is no way that you can get to claim that such and such thing is true. So if John just basically said, well, I don't think God exists, or I think the probability of God is absurdly low, which is something I think, well, then we can't get to the premise. And it would then be the case of Jimmy saying, well, now you have to prove that God doesn't exist. And we can, of course, say, I thought this was an argument about the virgin birth. And now we basically have to first unravel the entirety of existence and metaphysics to get to this historical argument. It's kind of a waste. But it's also the case that, like we were talking before about the nature of inspiration, Jimmy's view of inspiration is basically any claim that looks like it's historical has to be true. We will then argue, all right, well, the New Testament claims things that are historically not true, therefore it is not inspired, which means the argument can't show the truth of the virgin birth. I mean, really, all we're trying to do here is assert God says what the New Testament says. Whatever the New Testament says is true, but if we show, hey, the New Testament shows things that we know are not true, then all the claims fall apart.
Right.
And honestly, what Jimmy needed to do to make any of those premises actually likely is provide some sort of argumentation. Basically, again, the way this is that either everyone in the audience believes the premises, or there are some subpoints that Jimmy or anyone else would have to do to prop up those premises, to go and say, well, now disprove my premises, when everyone else is just like, well, we don't believe those. Why should we believe the New Testament is inspired? And now you're back to historical argumentation, which made the entirety of making that syllogism kind of a way of just burning clock.
Yeah, and I feel like what you're kind of describing here is basically that Jimmy is shifting the burden of proof. Like, he's laid out this argument that he's not supporting with any kind of information, really. It's just the argument. It's kind of like it's the start of a bigger opening, but he's only providing these like claims about things, and he's not supporting them. And then he shifts the burden of proof over to the atheist side, saying, well, now you got to disprove them, as if it's like, well, if you can't disprove this claim, then that means this claim's true.
Exactly.
And
yeah.
I feel like that's just not logical in this particular, like, it's a false dichotomy, because just because one person can't disprove your claim, it does not necessarily mean that your claim is automatically true.
At the very least, you need to establish for some reason that people should even believe the premises are true. It shouldn't be someone has to come along and show that they are false. And it might even be the fact that your system just doesn't even use it. So let me give the example of mathematics, where this sort of logic is used all the time. Like, if you pick up a book of Euclidean geometry, it starts with definitions and axioms. The axioms are supposed to be the starting premises that you read them and you're like, if these things aren't true, I don't understand anything. They seem to be these sorts of things that are self-evident. And then once the proof, the logical deductions come from that, you're like, well, I already believe the premises. The deductions were done in a logically satisfactory way. Therefore, I absolutely believe the premises because I believe the conclusion because I believe the premises. It would be a really weird thing for a mathematician to come along, throw out some axioms that no other mathematician believes, and then say, well, prove me wrong. We'll just say, well, we don't believe that, or that, so go away until we have a reason to.
Right. Exactly. So I feel like Jimmy has I don't know. I feel like this argument, while he seems to have put it together like under the understanding of like, oh, I'm talking to like a fellow Christian, and so
Yeah.
I'm proving this to a fellow Christian. Kind of like, I mean, I believe you said that at the very beginning of this, that it seems like this argument is only meant for other Christians. And, you know, honestly, that I feel like a lot of apologist content and apologist argumentation is exactly for that. It's kind of like one of those things where you got a marketing agency that, you know, markets to people that already own a product so that it reassures them that, you know, the reasons why they brought the product or that they feel better about buying the product. Like that's an actual marketing like gimmick out there. And I feel like a lot of apologetic arguments are just like that.
Oh, yeah. This is very much making people within the faith feel like that there is a lot of they're like their faith is somehow logically satisfactory. And honestly, creating syllogisms like that to reach the conclusions you want can be honestly a bit easy. And of course, if your whole thing is like, well, prove one of my premises wrong, again, you can get to all sorts of absurd things. I could say, well, let's take the famous syllogism, but mess with it. Socrates is a man. All men are elephants. Therefore, Socrates is an elephant. Prove my premise wrong. And it's like, everything I said was logically sound. And it's like, yeah, you would have to disprove my premises for the conclusion not to follow. But guess what? Unless you are in some really weird elephant cult, most people are not going to accept premise 2. So guess what? You got to now actually defend premise 2 and just saying, well, disprove it. It's like, no, you're the one making this grandiose assertion. And in his previous ones, he doesn't make one grandiose assertion. He has a whole bunch with all sorts of terms and metaphysics that are kind of sneaking in that I don't think any philosopher would allow through. I think a freshman paper would look at like if you did this in a freshman philosophy class, teacher would be like D minus, see me after class. That's what it feels like.
Yeah, you know, I totally agree with that assessment.
Next slide, please. So to make it easy, here are the premises. To prove my argument false, John could show us that if God exists, he wouldn't be infinitely perfect. He could show us that God doesn't exist. He could show that if God is infinitely perfect, he could still be inaccurate in what he says. In what he asserts. That's different than just saying. He could show us that if the New Testament is inspired by God, that doesn't mean God asserts what the New Testament asserts. He could show us that the New Testament is not inspired by God. He could show us that the New Testament doesn't assert the virgin birth. Or he could show us one of the last two premises, though they're rather straightforward, even though they're rather complex in how they're phrased.
Yeah, the last two premises are basically just statements of things that he's already previously established. Honestly, those premises 7 and 8, if I were writing this up, I would probably not have 7 and 8 as like these independent premises. I would basically say, hey, they follow from the previous one, so they're not separate things to defend. They already followed from the previous ones, and then that's how you can get to the ultimate conclusion. So which premises do I deny? Let's say 1 through 6.
So he's got a few more seconds here, but I think that he's pretty much just finishing off his shifting of the burden of proof. But I can't remember what he says.
Yeah, it is worth noting that while this might be an argument, at no point did he actually defend anything in this argument. And in terms of like debating points, it's like, well, how many arguments did you make and defend? Well, a number defended, 0. So how many points did he make? 0. In terms of like debate strategy, this would be a total fail. The best this can be is to somehow assure the Christian watching that, oh, look, there's logic to defend our beliefs. But the thing is about logic is it's much like with mathematics. If it doesn't match what you're describing, if you don't have true premises, it's just a bunch of numbers. In the same thing here, if he has no defense for these premises, there is no reason to believe any of it, and it's just words on a page.
Yeah, and I feel like if he's made any kind of claim, the only claim that he's made is like, well, God says it, so therefore I believe it. And, that's kind of what we discussed there right at the very beginning.
Yeah. And of course, I already mentioned this as Ken Ham logic, but now we're going to have to ask Jimmy some hard questions like, how old is the Earth?
Yeah. I feel like that's a pertinent question at this point.
Yeah.
My guess is he'd be better going for one of the first 6, but he's welcome to go for any of the 8 premises. But he needs to show that one or more of the premises is false in order to disprove an otherwise logically valid argument. So, next slide, please. John, it's over to you. Which of my premises do you want to attack?
Now, after this point, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I feel like this is the proverbial pigeon shitting on the chessboard and walking away like, disprove it.
Yeah. Now, I don't know what the constraints were when it comes to like time limits or things like that. I mean, considering, look, this whole thing was done in 5 minutes. So is this an opening statement? In which case, obviously, you're very limited. You're not going to be able to have, like all the evidence is marshaled in that first 5 minutes. That's totally fair. With a restriction like that, I can totally understand that. And maybe that's just, an issue ultimately with the formatting of the debate. And honestly, these sorts of 2-on-2 debates, later on, it becomes kind of an issue where everyone's like talking over each other. It's hard enough to have like, 2 people talking and, making it controlled enough for people to, get the point. But you got 4 people, and the moderator is just kind of it becomes more like a wrestling match, even if that's not the intention, just because it's so hard to then have people talk constructively. Nonetheless, this is not the way I probably would have tried to make that sort of argument. But on the other hand, if I was to ask, well, what sort of historical evidence can I point to make the claims plausible? Oh, all I have is what the Gospels say. Crap. That's all I got. You're literally left with just Matthew says it, and I am theologically bound to believe what this gospel claims to say. And even when I say claims to say, that itself has theological baggage in how that entire line of interpretation goes. If I were reading this and I disagreed with the genre of it being biographical, but I was seeing this more as a novel, well, in the same sort of way, well, what sorts of things does Harry Potter assert? Really, nothing. It's a novel. So there's all sorts of baggage and claims that are in the background here that just completely go undefended, that allows basically like, John and Darren potentially to basically say, well, I got 40 reasons to believe why even this one particular verse from the New Testament is completely historical hogwash. But then conversely, what Jimmy could do is try to find some way of showing the historical veracity of the accounts. That's what he would need to do, and he just completely doesn't. And so to an atheist, it's an epic fail. It's completely not even trying to be convincing.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I know that they were constrained on their opening arguments here and due to the format and everything, but I really feel like this was just not the best argument to put forward, because you're really placing all of your dominoes, I guess, into my God exists. And I feel like if you're going to start from that position when you're debating an atheist, you're honestly not even wanting to. It seems to me like, at least this is how I felt while watching the debate, it felt like Jimmy really wasn't wanting to engage in any kind of argument about the virgin birth. He's really wanting to engage in an argument about whether or not his God exists.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what the entire debate seemed like to me. Like, he was like, I don't want to talk about the virgin birth. I want to talk about whether or not God exists.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, this argument could only even begin to have any utility if it was an argument between Catholics. So, I mean, premise one is basically the Catholic Catechism, which is like, this multi-thousand-page document of all those things there. So, I mean, the first thing he does is rhetorically slam down the ground and says, this is true. The only way that's even going to begin is if his interlocutor also says, yep, I accept that giant collection of theological commitments. So basically, if they said premise 1, Vatican II, premise 2. Yeah. But on the other hand, I guess if Jimmy Akin were, say, arguing with, say, the late Raymond Brown, this great Catholic scholar of the New Testament, then they would at least have the starting premise of, that they follow the dictates of the magisterium. But that's not who he's arguing with here. He's not arguing with Raymond Brown. He's arguing with, well, non-Catholics, to put it mildly.
Yeah, exactly.
But
All right, are you ready to
Or-
shift to the Bethlehem Star?
Yeah.
Okay. All in all, for this virgin birth argument, I feel like what you said there, Aaron, it just fell flat for me, and I was not impressed by it. And I'm just a lowly engineer. I'm not a philosopher, but I feel like I can definitely follow the logical syllogisms and everything like that pretty well, and it just did not impress at all. Thank you, heathens, for joining us today. I hope that you enjoyed this little bit of information, this little bit of an analysis of this really poor argument for the virgin birth. I mean, honestly, I don't know how Jimmy Akin came up with this other than just to say, oh, I want to figure out how to say, God said it, therefore I believe it, but in a more complicated way. If you will, please let me know down below with what you thought about Jimmy Akin's syllogism, his proof in general for the virgin birth. I'd really love to know what you think about it. And while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.